all the way in the back.
I thought the presentation was very interesting. I'm sort of a fisherman, so I enjoyed the part about the trout. But the question that I have deals with what does all this mean? The potable water, the availability of water for consumption, and the longer term problems that we face in the United States with this whole question of good water, healthy water that can be consumed by human beings as well as the animals.
Could you hear that back, all the way back there?
Yes.
Some are shaking their heads, yes. So the question is, what does this mean to healthy, clean water? What does this information mean to this growing issue and concern that we have about as we go past 7 billion people on the earth in this finite water resource? What does this mean to our water resources here at home?
That's an excellent question, and kind of encompasses a lot of different things. One of the things I wanted to mention was that what Don and I were talking about with the fractures and crevices that make up the porosity or the open space within the aquifers in your county also feed the streams that Jeff was talking about. So, you know, the work we were doing refers to the susceptibility of the aquifer to groundwater contamination, and that contamination can feed wells as well as surface waters that are inhabited by the trout and other species. But the broader question of what does this all mean for the United States, for the world, as far as water quality? The more, this is just my philosophy, but the more people you have in an area, the more potential you have for degrading water quality in the aquifers and surface water. And it's something that we pretty much accept, because basically if you go into an area, you do row crop agriculture, you put in roads, you have septic systems, you inhabit the area, you have to assume you're going to contaminate the water to some extent. What we're doing is trying to show what the potential is for groundwater contamination and surface water contamination, and potential ways of avoiding that. You know, putting facilities in areas that shouldn't be. For example, karst areas are a bad place to put landfills, and so once you understand the limits of your environment, the better off you're going to be as far as planning for future development.
Well, the one thing I'll add to what Sam was mentioning is, so you remember some of the photos you saw with the crop lines, especially that one field, just one rectangular long field that had hundreds and hundreds of crevices and fractures in them. Those just happen to be serendipitous that the farmer hadn't cropped that alfalfa field. All the fields in that area have the same kinds of density of fractures. There's literally, we saw close to 18,000, but that's just from about 150 sites. Just imagine how many of those fractures that are near the surface within a few feet, which are actually direct conduits to the aquifer. There must be hundreds of thousands of them just in your county. So your county is unique in that this very thin overburden, the glacier ice never did quite make it here during the last glaciations, the 4 last glaciations. So you have this very fragile surface sitting just below bedrock, just above, you know, you just have 2 or 3 feet above bedrock. And I think it wasn't until, I don't think anybody at the survey had seen this kind of phenomenon occur in their lifetime. So I think what it showed to us is just how complex this bedrock fracture crevice system is in this region. And our top structural geologist, Dr. John Nelson, at the Illinois State Geological Survey, said that this study in this county warrants much further research into the structure of the bedrock surface. And Joe Daviess seems to be right at the flexure line, and he said he had never seen that before. So, but we don't have a budget yet, so I'm not sure when we're going to be back up there again. But, I think this just shows the fragility of this surface up here, and leads into what Jeff was talking about.
Other questions here?
The fields that you had the crop lines in back in 2012, have you had observation on those fields since then, or any observation on those fields this year, where you had a little different climate?
No, we haven't looked at it, but we did look at aerial photography that goes back to 1938, 46. And we do see the crop lines occasionally in some of these areas, but they're faint, and you know, and we're seeing the same ones that we see. So the fractures, the vegetative crop lines basically highlight fractures that are present, and those aren't changing. Is that pretty much your question?
I hear. Some of the fields that I'm familiar with that have crop lines in, this year, because of the extremely wet season, actually killed the alfalfa because there is no drainage. There is no drainage under even though there is fractured bedrock, there is no drainage from the silt loam, the clay silt loam, that undermines that and fills those structures or those fractures. So actually, it's holding water rather than allowing water to go down.
And probably if we base it on what is that on? Yes. Yeah. If we base it on what the aerophotography history and then what the National Climatic Center has been showing with this one graph I showed, we may not see that temporal event in those conditions. Remember, it was like the perfect, I think Sam's called it a perfect storm, summer, where we had all of these various factors coming in, even a hurricane that came up and missed your county, to come together to make those fractures show up. But it's been 60 years since they were seen the last time. So in this clarity, I should say, and remember, they have to be captured by some kind of imagery. So I think this was about the first time since 60 years. So.
Okay, question all the way in the back.
Have you determined if those lines go through the Maquoketa Shale, or do they stop there?
Well, the Maquoketa Shale sits on top of the Galena Dolomites, and we didn't see, I don't think we saw the lines in the Maquoketa Shale, if any. So, you know, where the Maquoketa is, we really didn't see a whole lot of activity as far as crevices. Going back to this question, I get the impression you're saying that the fractures, for the most part, are filled with sediment or fine sediments, and that's why there's very little drainage. Is that right? Is that correct?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Yeah, so you're not getting drainage by these fractures because a lot of them are filled with sediments. And so we excavated one of the fractures, a couple of the fractures in one of the fields, and indeed, you know, a lot of these fractures are filled with fine sediments. And one of the...
Is it a water holding sediment then?
It is, yes, it is. Yeah, and when there's a drought like that, you get macropores, which are just basically cracks, mud cracks in the soil, and you get the same cracks in the sediments within the fractures. If you go deep enough, you're in a zone called the unsaturated zone. If you go deep enough, a lot of those fractures are open, the sediments are gone, or they've never been there. But you see, the sediments within fractures are ephemeral things; they come and go. And so we do, in fact, see areas where a lot of them are plugged near the surface, but they're actively open at depth, and the groundwater's flowing through them. So, to an extent, there is protection for the underlying aquifer, but because it's a system where some are filled, some are not, you're getting water recharging the aquifer, rainfall, snow melt, recharging the aquifer all over the county, but not going into every fracture and every crevice. But I'm not sure what the percentage is, and we're still looking at that. But a lot of them are open, probably at least half of them, if not more.
Question here.
Looking at groundwater, surface water intermingling, I have a dead elm tree, about 10 inches diameter, that last spring, I was watching the water, probably, I would guess, 20 to 50 gallons per minute, going down through around the tree. Now, is this going to be a problem? And should there be some remedial action taken?
Geez, I have to say it.
Can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, it's, how deep is your soil in that area?
It's running 3 to 4 foot.
3 to 4 feet. The question was, the gentleman has an elm tree on his property where water is running down there at a rapid rate when there's rainfall.
This was spring.
Spring, yeah. So
Spring, fall.
So the question is, should he remediate that or just let the water go down? I believe it's 4 feet of soil. It's not. I mean, if the whole area collapses under the tree, you're gonna have a small sinkhole that eventually will fill in. I mean, unless it's draining something that's hazardous, and I can't imagine it'd be a problem as far as the land loss of soil, that sort of thing, unless the water feeding it is eroding the soil. So I just let it go.
Other questions? Yep.
Steve Braun moved reference to website where we can access the report of their research. Could you give us that web address?
Ron, do you know the web address for the report that you had a dozen copies of out?
There's, I think, they said they made about 40 copies of the page, and the first page, it's out there on the registration table, has the URL website that you can go to directly.
They weren't out there when we came through.
They weren't out there.
I have a copy up here, and it's pretty long, so I'll keep this up here if you want to come write it down, or
Share it in email.
yeah, we can share it through email.
Yeah.
It's there. They're up at the registration table.
There are still some up at the registration table. All right.
Yeah, and that has all the direct address.
Yeah. Yes.
Will, you guys think this problem will fix itself because the earth is just going to do self-filtering, and so all of the stuff that comes from the surface will be fine?
Okay.
I'm sorry, that was kind of loaded.
No, it's a good question. Question is, will the earth self-filter any contaminants going into the system. And it's a very good question. The answer is no, because what we've done in other parts of Illinois and this part of Illinois and Daviess County is we looked at background concentrations for different elements, ions in the water, sodium chloride, nitrate, phosphate, a little bit, just everything. And what we see throughout the country, throughout Illinois, is that there's a pre-settlement background, a range of concentrations for ions, elements in water, dissolved minerals in water. And once you have settlement coming in, then these things tend to increase. For example, road salt in the Illinois River, we found is increasing at a rate of 1 milligram per liter per year since the early 1940s or earlier. And so that doesn't sound like much, but and you continue that for 100 years, almost 100 years. So the baseline concentration for chloride is 100 times what it was, and then you do that for another 100 years. It just keeps, the sodium chloride concentration in the rivers keeps increasing, because what's happening is the road salt and other sources of sodium chloride are running into the soils and getting into the aquifers and building up, and it takes a long time for this to discharge. So it's a buildup of these contaminants, and so the soils aren't really going to take care of it. What's needed is for example, in the Chicago area, is some other means of getting rid of the snow in the wintertime, and so in answer to your question, the ground, the planet's not going to clean it up for you. Habits have to change to avoid increasing things like sodium chloride in water, so that it doesn't kill all the fish and the other biota in the streams, which ultimately will. So.
Here.
Is there a higher concentration of toxins in karst areas as opposed to non-karst areas? All the dairy farms get inspected every year for contaminants, and I don't know or hear issues. Except unless it's the well casing or some other issue, but I don't hear it from the groundwater.
So just the question is there, in karst areas, is there higher toxicity? Is that what you're saying?
Let's just say are there more contaminants coming from the surface down? I don't care about the Illinois River.
Yeah.
No, that's a good question. We did some work with Walt Kelly from the Illinois Water Survey in Wisconsin, and they were having serious problems with groundwater contamination from large animal feeding operations up there, and they have karst as well. And what happens is that there will be a slug of contaminants going through bacteria, nitrogen, ammonia, nitrate, sodium chloride, just everything, viruses associated with the animal feedlots, and it goes through the aquifer very quickly, but it goes through it, a course of several days. So we sampled the well, and it was the water coming out of the tap for this particular home was brown and foamy, like the stuff that was flowing across the fields. And then somebody from the University of Wisconsin came to the same place 2 days later, and he was going to sample it for viruses, and the water was clean. And he analyzed it, there was no bacteria. When we analyzed it, it was full of bacteria, E. coli and other bacteria. So, it's not where the water goes, the contaminants go in, and they stay there and then build up. in karst, they tend to go through there very quickly. But if you happen to be drinking from your well at that time, then there were cases up there where families were getting rather sick, and their children were ended up in the hospital. So it's a very real thing, and it's complex. I mean, you go up there and say, well, my well's contaminated, or somebody's sick in our family, possibly from the well, and then it's checked and it's clean, and it's because of this ephemeral contamination event that occurs sometimes.
All the way in the back, the woman, yep.
I wanted to ask the gentleman on the trout restoration, you're showing all the sediment that you take out of the rivers. What do you do with that sediment? Is it reusable, or does it have too much nitrogen and nitrates and things in it?
Yeah, where we can use it, I mean, it's topsoil. It's great topsoil off the ridge tops. It's a great material. It's a hauling situation though, and it's very expensive to haul it out of the area. So typically it's removed out of the floodplains and put up against the edge. A lot of times, if the landowner has a place, we'll give it to the landowner and he'll sell it for landscaping.
Yep, right here.
In regard to Sam's response to this gentleman back here, Kewaunee County in Wisconsin, there is continuous and numerous litigation about agri-pollution of wells from mega dairies. There are 16 miles of Lake Michigan that are polluted along Kewaunee County. Okay, so I'm going to go to this question for Sam and Don. We had a litigation here in this county a couple of years ago regarding a mega dairy, and Sam provided a professional and thoughtful and exhaustive presentation. Now, I'm going to connect this with something Steve said earlier about outreach and education. The judges in Illinois are elected. They're not appointed. We had a situation in this county where we had a reactionary judge who had a kangaroo court, I would characterize, and allowed individuals to vilify and to eviscerate Sam's professionalism and his ability to exhaustively provide a description of what the karst situation was in this county. So, from the viewpoint of education and outreach, you talk about Sherry Bustos. I think we ought to be thinking and seriously considering the candidates who run for judges in this county, because that's the filtering system here.
Is there a question, Jerry?
Yes, there is. What was your sense about, the question for Don and Sam is this. The social sciences are considered soft sciences. Psychology, sociology, anthropology, ethnography, all of which I'm familiar with. Now, in the court of Kevin Ward, geology appeared to be a soft science based on what his rulings were. Is there real integrity and hard empirical evidence in geology?
Don't get Sam going on.
Please.
So the question is I think the question is how confident are we in the scientific evidence that this is karst geology?
That's right. You're here doing this presentation. You've done it before. How authentic is this? How valid is it? How reliable is it?
It's valid. I mean, as I said in my presentation, we mapped the state of Illinois and all the karst areas in the mid-1990s, and we took the areas where there were carbonated bedrock, there were crevices, there were sinkholes. I mean, you go to any areas, and this, by definition, is karst. And karst means that the aquifer is susceptible to groundwater contamination, surface-borne contaminants. And, it's clearly karst. There are degrees of karstification. If you go into areas in Kentucky, the crevices are huge. I mean, they have giant caves. You obviously don't have that here. So, and one of the problems is, and it's a problem that's been around for a long time, is if If you have sinkholes, people equate karst with sinkholes. So sinkhole equals karst. And if you don't have sinkholes, then you have lawyers that will argue, it's not karst because there are no sinkholes. But in Minnesota, they have large cave systems that run through an area. There's rivers running through them, and it's a karst aquifer, and there are no sinkholes in the area. And you think, well, if you were a lawyer, you'd say, well, it's not karst because there's no sinkholes. But that's not the case. And you come into this area, we looked for sinkholes. We didn't, in the Galena Dolomite, and looking at aerial photography, we just didn't see it. And we thought, well, there's no sinkholes that we can see. We walked out on the ground, and you go in areas that are not plowed, and you see sinkholes, small sinkholes, because the soil's so thin. So it's definitely karst, and definitely has a hydrogeology that equates to anything we see anywhere else. So yeah, it's very solid science.
All right. One.
I was going to mention since that event occurred, it was too bad the drought didn't occur during that testimony. The photograph that both Sam and I had in our presentations, the one where he said that it was taken out of the plane with his foot on the door and seat belted to the pilot and all that. Those crevices that were very obvious in those alfalfa fields were pointing right next door to the field where the capo site was. And we never saw those on the ground when we were there. And lastly, I've been following, been monitoring that site since '09 and after it was closed. I don't know if many of you knew this, but shortly after the site was closed, a sinkhole opened up on the side of one of the containment ponds. And I said to Sam, why didn't Mother Nature act, a couple of years ago? But that was because they did disturb the ground, and the ground reacted. I mean, it said, okay, you dug in me, and bang, and a sinkhole opened up about a year later. And talk about a smoking gun. Too bad, but it didn't happen. Mother Nature didn't work in concert with us.
All right, we're going to take one more question, and then before we take this question, I just want to thank the panelists again for being here. So if we can thank them. Remind you that they'll be tomorrow, Beth, at the Elizabeth Community Center from 9 to 11. So if you want to learn more, there's another opportunity. And I think they'll probably stay here for a little while after for individual questions.